Welcome to this special bonus episode of the Passive House podcast. I'm Zach Semke, director of Passive House Accelerator, and we're pleased to be sharing a series of bonus episodes recorded at PhiusCon 2022 in Chicago. These interviews were made possible by generous support from Corp and Zola Windows. In this interview, Passive House podcast co-host Matthew Cutler-Welsh speaks with Mark Ginsberg of Curtis Ginsberg Architects. Enjoy.
Your time, Mark. I really appreciate it. It's great to get the chance to sit down and talk to you physically here at PhiusCon. How are you enjoying the conference?
I'm enjoying it. As I said, it's a lot of like-minded nerds, and I learn things.
Yeah. I want to go back in time a little bit leading up to today. Tell us a bit about your background and how you got into the industry.
Okay, so there are a few things. Both my parents were politically active.
Yeah.
My father was one of the first 10 environmental law professors in the country. So I have a family that was interested in sustainability or environmental issues. In college, I double majored in theater design, set and lighting design, and government urban policy.
They seem related.
Of course. And afterwards I was able to get a job at New York City planning, and I realized that most planners had another degree, and both because of the people who were there and my interests, I went to architecture school.
Yeah.
And I was interested in sustainability then. And then I also got interested in affordable housing, which is our practice I define as being we do a lot of institutional governmental work too, but largely multifamily affordable housing, and most of it sustainable, and a significant amount passive house now. And then my partner, before we joined forces, worked at a firm that did what's considered maybe the first sustainable building in the country, the National Audubon building in New York. So when we started, we both cared about an environmental commitment in the bigger sense of the word, creating sustainable buildings for the long term.
Yeah.
And to some degree, the world's caught up, but we've also learned a few things in 30 years.
Yeah.
So at one point, I wrote a spec on roofing, because I didn't like the HPD, which is the New York City Housing Agency spec.
Right.
And I put in a white roof. Well, they then took that and made that their spec, so all of a sudden, all their projects were getting white roofs.
Right.
And, it works like that. We got into passive house, and I have to give a lot of credit to Steve Bluestone, who was a client of ours, who was working for about 5 to 10 years of how we could get a building to passive house, looking at using ICF insulated concrete forms and heat pumps, and so then we did Beach Green Dune 1 with him,
right?
And which was our first passive house, and since then, we also did with Steve a number of Sandy replacement homes in Staten Island.
Oh, wow.
4 of those were passive house.
Yeah.
And then since then...
Were they funded? Was there funding for that?
That was federal funding.
Right.
I'm not sure they knew we were doing passive house. The city liked it. And I should say we did about 30 buildings, and all of them were energy efficient.
Yeah.
But we got some money to do 4 of them as full certified passive house.
Right. Beyond just insurance claims from
No, this
Sandy?
was after Sandy. We got the city and the state got a lot of money from HUD, the federal government.
Yeah.
And people below a certain income level, their houses would either be repaired, raised, or replaced.
Yeah.
And so these were some replacement houses. And there were different ways they could do it. They could also do it on their own with money and so on. So
were there no restrictions about having to do like for like?
Well, first of all, we had to comply with the code, so we were raising all of them significantly above the ground because when they were built, there were no flood regulations.
Right. Yeah.
And so it was like for like, but that was a little tricky because we had buildings that were very idiosyncratic, didn't meet current codes and so on.
Yeah.
And so we were building new buildings that gave them about the same amount of space, but complied with current codes and were energy efficient and were significantly above the flood elevation. And since then, Beach Green Dune 1, we have done 5 more large passive house. We have, I think, 2 more in construction and a number in design.
Yep.
And we're also going, almost as importantly, but it's tied together, we just finished our first 2 all-electric multifamily buildings.
Wow.
Which, one of the things that in the analysis Lois and I have done, although Lois did more of the number crunching, we found that heating and cooling in a multifamily passive house is 10 to 15% of the energy used.
Yeah.
And then the other 90 is basically divided equally between plug loads and hot water.
Mm-hmm.
And so the all-electric building where you have ground source heat pumps, and we're using that for the hot water as well as heating and cooling, which should cut down on the energy required for the hot water. That's, to me, the next holy grail step in passive house is getting the hot water consumption. And typically, these are affordable housing buildings, and the density is much higher than predicted, so the water use is much higher than in the passive house model.
There's a lot in there. So before we go on, what climate zone is that in?
I think it's largely 6.
What does that mean?
In New York City.
So pretty cold winters?
Pretty cold winters and very hot humid summers.
Would that scenario work elsewhere, do you think, as well?
Yeah. In the places without cold winters, there's the air source heat pump works better for hot water because it loses its efficiency below 30 degrees.
Right.
And we get below 30 degrees, but if you're on the coast in California or in the south, you may never get it, and then the air source hot water heat pumps are good. And we're doing some buildings with air source hot water heat pumps.
So you can tweak the specification or the particular products you choose to achieve a similar goal in different places.
And we're also looking at using a wastewater heat pump, because all the water that goes down the drain is about 60 degrees.
Right, so you can recover heat
we're recovering
from the drain.
A company you put a tank in and you recover the heat from that. And that seems, I found out about it from an engineer in Seattle, and that seems to be a really efficient system.
Yeah, otherwise it's just waste heat. It makes a lot of sense.
Right. I mean, there are even people talking about trying to recover heat from the sewers. Because that's one.
There's a lot there.
As we get better at the building of the envelope, we're finding the other places we might find waste heat.
And so the other point you made there, the fully electric house is an achievement. What's the driver for that?
Well, this one was before. Well, there have been a few drivers. We had a gas ban in Brooklyn and part of Queens for a while that ended. There are no new gas connections.
Right.
That's true in Westchester, just north of New York City. Then New York City last year, a number of us, I testified for it, passed legislation that between 2025 and 2027, all new construction is going to have to be all electric, with certain exceptions.
Yep.
So all of a sudden, all our clients are very interested in doing all electric because they see the writing on the wall.
Yeah.
What the harder nut to crack, which we're working on, but is electrifying existing buildings.
Yeah, right.
Because in New York, it's estimated that 85% of the buildings here today will be here in 2050. Mm-hmm. And the particularly with tenants in place or residents in place, it's much harder. And so many of our buildings are lot line buildings at a street wall, often have historic facades. So trying to work through how we do that we're doing it on some projects, but is the next step of the holy grail of full electrification.
Right. So it sounds like you had an underlying kind of motivation to go that way, but it's been helped by policy.
By policy, and it also depends on clients. There's some clients, we're working with the Jonathan Rose company, and when I mentioned embodied carbon, they said, yeah, we want to deal with embodied carbon. We have other clients, when you mention embodied carbon, it's sort of, what's that? And the problem with embodied carbon is, unlike operational carbon, where they get the fact that if we reduce the consumption, they should save money. And their residents, who are typically, since most of the buildings we do are affordable, can't pay more rent, so they're better protected. But the embodied carbon has no financial incentive at this point.
No. Or any penalties for not doing it.
Right. There's starting to be some discussion of codes of putting it in. And what we've done as an office is, 2 years ago, a group of people got together and wrote like a 5-page memo on embodied carbon and things we could do. So, for example, I didn't know that a UPVC window, besides being quite energy efficient, has about half, 2/3 the embodied carbon of an aluminum window. So we're getting and is cost competitive with the aluminum window. So we're trying to work on that too as we can.
I want to come back to a couple of other things that you mentioned that I think kind of roll off your tongue pretty easily. One was sustainable, and the other one's affordable. How do you define? Let's start with sustainable. What does that mean, and how do you define a sustainable building?
Sustainable. There are a few different things, because sustainable is a big tent.
Well, and also, has that definition changed? Because we started talking at the beginning of your journey.
Definitely. And first of all, I look at Passive House, to me, is leading my concerns about sustainability, because I think climate change is the existential issue, and we've got to reduce our operational and embodied carbon, but we want to do that in a healthy way. But typically in New York City, for the affordable housing, we either have to do enterprise green communities or LEED in addition, and then we can do Passive House. But doing
when
passive,
you say you have to,
the city funding agencies or the state funding agencies for affordable housing are requiring it. And normally we do enterprise green communities, and it pushes things that Passive House doesn't care about. It cares about, but isn't part of the credits. Low VOC, adjacency to transit, recycling of waste. I could go on.
The
broader issues, which are totally tied in, and typically, because the buildings are so energy efficient, and also we make them water efficient to help with Passive House, that gives us lots of points in the other program. But the city, with enterprise green communities, has certain things that are mandated. Like, well, I'm not sure it's mandated, but heavily encourage smoke-free buildings. They also want meters on every riser, so that if like a toilet starts really running, you can see the water consumption.
Every riser, so not just every apartment?
Well, you can do it either way, but typically our clients have done it on the riser, because you might have 20 toilets on a riser, and this is a way to do it more efficiently. And it means if you start seeing a lot of water running, you need to check all the units. It isn't always the toilet. It could be the faucet or the shower or a break in the line.
So having all those things in place, so you get the requirements for LEED or something that is Passive House or close to Passive House, does that help define now what sustainability is?
I think so. The other thing I would add tied into this is the whole concept of net zero. And in New York City, we can't make our buildings on-site net zero. Our buildings are typically 6, 8, 10 stories, and when you get that high, you don't have enough roof area, plus there are zoning limitations that we're trying to change to increase the amount of PV. You can generate 30, maybe 40% of the power on site. However, and this is the point, if you look at the per capita carbon footprint people in New York City, there are two things that affect carbon footprint. Wealth is one,
Right.
but the other is location, mass transit, and New York City, when you try to correct for wealth, and you look at two neighborhoods of about the same wealth, in New York City, the carbon footprint is half,
Wow.
largely because of the mass transit.
But the other point there is on an individual basis, it's quite tricky. But on a neighbourhood scale or a regional scale, you can start to play off buildings or make buildings share.
Well, New York State has legislated that in 2040 our grid will be clean. And not my area of expertise, but they've just approved two big projects, which will be a combination of taking hydropower down from Canada, who has excess hydropower, and also upstate solar power.
Right.
So one thing that happened is we closed the Indian Point nuclear reactor, which was clean even if it had other issues.
Right, sure.
And so instead of having a grid that was 30% clean, it's now 15 or 20%.
Yeah.
But these two are going to get us up to 60 or 70% clean. And then we keep going.
Yeah. You mentioned affordability early on.
Right.
So same question. How do you define that? Or
Well,
how is it defined?
There are a number of different definitions. So it's, again, one of those somewhat squishy words but I'll look at it as a starting point. How many households, and I'm concentrated in New York City, could afford a new construction one bedroom? And it varies with interest rates and other things, but I did a study with a friend who was an economist, and it's 15 to 20% of the households in New York.
So 15 to 20% could
afford market rate new construction.
people there that could afford to build.
But that's somewhat misleading in that you have a lot of existing buildings that, because they built them a while ago, although they're paying maintenance and operation, they can break even at a much lower level.
Yeah.
But I think the numbers are like 30 or 40% of households in New York are paying more than 30% of their income for housing.
Yeah.
So there is a real affordability issue.
Yeah.
And it gets more complicated. And this is one of the things I mentioned in our panel yesterday. When we have a 100-unit affordable build passive house, great. We'll have 100,000 applications for those 100 units.
Right.
Now, they all don't
so you
qualify.
Got one in 1,000
it's
chances.
a lottery.
Yeah.
So it should be fair, but it's a real... So the people moving in are happy to get an apartment that's new, that's clean, that they can afford.
Yeah, right.
Some of them may be happy that it's passive house or it's energy efficient and so on, but that's secondary.
Yeah, they just want a roof over their head.
But to the city's credit and the state's credit, and a lot of affordable housing around the country has emphasized energy efficiency and sustainability over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And hopefully is a model that it gets expanded into market rate.
Yeah. So that 30% seems to be a fairly well recognised measure. So 30% of income towards housing costs.
Right.
Is that a reasonable definition?
Interesting question. It used to be 25%.
Yeah.
And at some point in the 70s, they changed it to 30% because it made the numbers work better.
Yeah.
So it is a fairly arbitrary number.
Yeah.
But it's a good starting point.
Yeah.
And then there's studies done with households paying more than 50% of their cost for housing, and they're in trouble.
Yeah. And that includes, it's not just mortgages, right? Or is that just the servicing a loan or rent?
Well, it's however you're paying for your housing. So in New York, most people rent.
Yeah.
So it will be your rent.
Plus your any
utilities. Yeah. But if you own, and there are some affordable home ownership, it would be your mortgage, your maintenance costs, and then any utilities.
Right. So if you can bring utility bills down, if that's biting into that total, that can help.
Well, it also, most of the buildings we do are rental.
Right.
Our clients own them forever.
Yep.
They don't build and sell. They build and they own.
Yeah.
So there are two things of exactly what you're talking about. First of all, and the residents can't pay more in general because they're lower income and they have income.
Yeah.
They may pay a little more over time, but it protects the owner because their operating costs should not go up that much because they're using much less energy.
Yeah.
It also protects the residents that the air conditioning cost may be $100 a year to air condition your apartment. And because it's a passive house, tight envelope, well insulated, it's not going to go up much, even if electric or utility rates go up.
Yeah, someone showed a really good graph showing that yesterday, how it makes passive house a really great equity enabler, because if you have an inefficient house, it amplifies that effect of price fluctuations, whereas you're insulating yourself that not just from the environment.
You're saying it better than I did, but yes, that it's definitely.
Well, it displayed it quite nicely in this graph, that it shows that the more efficient you are, the more protection you have against future fluctuations.
The other thing that, and this becomes more of an issue in existing buildings. New York City has Local Law 97.
I've heard a lot about that, and I'm not even from here, but I've...
Well, it is a model, and I've been on a committee that is working on implementing it, and it's pretty complicated. But basically, it's going to ratchet down the per square foot carbon footprint of buildings in 2025 is the first. And if you don't meet the requirements, you in effect are taxed.
Right.
And then in 2030 it gets lower, in 2035 it gets lower. So we get to the city and state's goal of basically being net zero in 2050.
So it's similar to the BC's energy step code, like a roadmap of, of this is where we're going.
And so for affordable housing, which tends to have quite dense number of people per square feet, it's doubly important to reduce your energy consumption. Affordable housing has prescriptive measures to 2035, but in 2035 we're going to have to meet the requirements. Our passive house buildings meet the 2050 requirements now, so it protects protects them. And New York State has similar legislation, and I think other states are heading that way. And then also the Inflation Reduction Act has money and tax credits, which will hopefully help encourage it more.
It's going back to what you said about some people who just want a roof over their head, and you have basically 1,000-fold demand for just a house, just a place to live. Is there a tension there between just producing houses as quickly and as cheaply as possible and building that at a reasonable standard?
There is, because for lots of good reasons, over my career, we've made it more and more expensive to build a unit of housing with handicapped accessibility. We now have sprinkler requirements. I could go on. They're all done for good reasons. But we have to be careful of encouraging as cost effective as possible. At the same time, that can be dangerous. If you cut too many corners and you build a shoddy building, that's not cost effective because it won't last. And I would argue if you build a building that's using a lot of energy, that's not cost effective because it's not sustainable.
So how do we resolve that there is this huge demand for housing? It needs to be done quickly and provide shelter for people.
And this is somewhat off of the sustainability side for a second. Our zoning in New York City and in the suburbs around New York City drastically limits what we can build. We have to, and this is something else I've been very involved in, is loosen the straitjacket to build more housing, because we have a tremendous need for housing. Like, we're improving the mass transit system in Long Island, but if you go out to the train stations, it's parking lots and one-story buildings where there should be transit-oriented development. So I think part of it is largely through zoning and finding land, making land available to build the housing of all income levels. Because if you build more market rate housing, there'll be less pressure in neighborhoods that are relatively affordable.
Sure.
But tied into that, we've got to build as energy efficiently as we can and as sustainability. And what was interesting, the keynote yesterday, we had a developer, going blank on his name.
Early on in the day?
Yes.
I can't remember the name. I'll look it up.
Okay, I do this much too often. I'll remember it in a second. Talked about the project he did, and the added cost of doing passive house was about 2%.
Yes.
But there was a 10-year payback, which is about, as a developer, the maximum length they want to see for a payback.
Yeah.
But you could justify it economically, besides justifying it morally and just for doing our part to save the planet.
Yeah. Hey, look, covered a lot, and there's probably a lot more we could talk about. Doing some great work in some challenging conditions, but I also am quite inspired. There's a lot of really good stuff happening in New York. You know, it seems to be quite progressive in some of the policies that have been enacted in that local space, and just influencing that local area. So I think there is some really good stuff going on there. Where would you like to see things in 5 years' time?
Well, I'd like to see, in both New York and Massachusetts seem to be doing this, is passive house as a way to meet the energy code.
Right.
So I'm not doing the passive house calculations, or somebody's doing it and then having to do separate calculations to show we comply with the energy code. So that would be one thing.
What needs to happen to make that reality? Does it make sense?
Well, the simplest way would be the ICC's energy code, the International Code Council, to do that, because that's then the model code for, I think, all 50 states.
Right, and then others can just reference that and say...
What is happening is you see places like New York and Massachusetts and Seattle, Washington, and California doing things like this, which will then, because this often happens, get fed into the national code.
Yeah.
So that's one whole area. And the other area, for affordable housing and energy efficiency, federal money.
Right.
I think the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a strange name, is also the Carbon Reduction Act. It's doing it largely by carrots, not sticks, which I think politically is going to work better.
For now,
The politics in this country are...
we won't go there.
Yes, but if you can do things that encourage people to do it, it is good.
It's a much more positive way, yeah. Hey, well, thank you for your time, but also for your work that you've been doing and continuing to do. It's great knowing that there's people out there like yourself.
Well, it makes one feel like, as hard as doing buildings are in general, like you're doing something as a model that hopefully makes things in your own small way a little better.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.